Let me be clear, I don't mean to belittle what people in the Salem Witch Trials went through. I wouldn't want to go through that. Like, point blank, would not want to do it. But there are some events so horrendous that I might just want to choose that over that, you know? Welcome back, MA fam. I'm your host, Rachel Fisher. Vampire version today. Hee hee, spooky season. And today we are counting down part 2 of top 10 events in history scarier than the Salem Witch Trials. I'm gonna go take these out now, so I don't. Number 10, the Ghost Girls. Sounds spooky, and it kinda is, but the reality was a lot darker. In the 1920s, the Ghost Girls were women who took up work painting the dials of watches with glow-in-the-dark paint. Though they were assured it was safe, that was far from the truth, though they may not have known that at the time. How did the paint glow, after all? It was radioactive. In order to make sure that they could paint precise lines on the dials, occasionally they would lick the tip of the brush. This would cause them to consume enough radioactive material to cause some serious damage, especially since they would paint around 250 dials a day on average, and they were getting paid like pennies. Some girls would even paint their teeth and nails with the material to wow gents at the dance hall, but ever so slowly they were being eaten away from the inside. Their bones and jaws dissolved, some even developing massive tumors on their legs, neck, everywhere. The first death was Molly Maggia, died after suffering burning ulcers and agonizing aches, her jawbone completely dissolved, and so on. The USRC covered them up, saying that they weren't responsible until dozens more died by extreme tumors and horrific other illnesses resulting from the radium. Even the inventor died. It was just chaotic, and apparently if you stand over their graves today with like a Geiger counter, it goes off the charts. Number 9, the Great Fire of London. Despite popular belief, during the Salem Witch Trials, witches weren't burned to death. They were only hanged. And I know this is a grim thought, but out of the two, I'd much rather be hanged than a pyre with my name on it. Just not a thing, especially as a vampire. No thank you. Which is why the Great Fire of London is awful, though it may have helped get rid of the plague. Fun fact. Back in the 1660s, buildings were basically piles of kindling waiting to roast marshmallows. They were so flammable. They were made of timber, pitch, thatch, and they were packed close together like Mattamy homes. London was also one of the largest cities in Europe at the time, with 350,000 people living in it. I know that's kind of laughable considering like most cities today have like millions of people. Perspective. But then one day on September 2nd in 1666, in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane, a fire started and didn't stop. By 1 a.m. the house was consumed and soon was Pudding Lane and Fish Hill. Great names, I know. Aided by strong wind blowing embers this way and that, finally it hit a warehouse stocked with combustible products like oil and tallow, which resulted in obviously. They didn't have an organized fire brigade, but one thing they did was blow up buildings in the path of the fire. But it took until September 5th for the fire to be controlled. But the ground was still too hot to walk on for days. Even Charles II, the King of England, was seen helping put out the fire. The city had to be almost entirely reconstructed from the ground up. Number 8. The Crimes of Elizabeth Bathory. A small town called Salem, Massachusetts took the lives of 20 people. Meanwhile, a couple decades earlier in Europe, one woman took the lives of over 600 women. Bathory was born evil. There's some speculation that she didn't take as many lives as she did, but even if she took like 2, it was the way that she did it that was horrific. She was born on August 7th, 1560 to a wealthy Hungarian family. They were extremely powerful, so couldn't touch them. She married Count Ferenc, a war hero with notorious skill in battle. However, he died a few years into their marriage, and soon Bathory became obsessed with youth and immortality. Here's where things get really vile. She would capture young virgin women from the village below and keep them as her bloody pets. She would put them through gruesome, and I mean it when I say that, before eventually draining them and bathing in their blood. Soon she stepped up to a bigger game, seeking out noble girls who needed education and guidance. They would be sent to live with her, being seen as a huge honor, and then die mysteriously. Imagine the worst kind of torment. Like imagine the worst kind. The kind you would find in the pits of hell. That's what she did. When she was finally caught, her diary detailed the 650 young women she had taken. 3 of her servants were executed, but she was locked away in her tower for the rest of her days. Hopefully she's now facing that torment in a very fiery, hot pit. Number 7, the French Revolution. You may be surprised to find this on the list. After all, like, vive la révolution, d'accord. But got pretty damn violent and really scary, and I wouldn't have wanted to be there. To be clear, I'm talking about the one where a bunch of people lost their heads, if you didn't know. Between 1793 to 94, brought on by the indulgence and arrogance of the aristocracy, the people rose up in violent protest. This brief period saw over 27,000 people killed by horrendous means. 17,000 were executed by the guillotine, while 10,000 perished under horrific conditions in prison. Maximilien Robespierre led the revolution, though he too would soon fall prey to the bloody circumstances. He wasn't a very good guy. Much like the Salem Witch Trials, anyone who was accused did not see a fair trial. In Nantes, a few more thousand anti-revolutionaries were drowned. Revolutionaries also dug up the graves of nobles and destroyed the remains, so no longer satisfied with just destroying the living. What started as a rise for the people turned into the gruesomest bloodbath in history. Well, one of them. Number 6, Jonestown. I would take a coven over a cult any day. I don't know if there's a difference, but there might be. They work together, you know, to make magic happen, and that sounds damn good to me, you know what I mean? Practical Magic is my favorite movie. It's awesome. Nicole Kidman, Sandra Bullock. I'm sure most of you who've been following this channel know why Jonestown is on this list. It is the event that coined the phrase, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid." It's a big deal. The Jonestown massacre was the result of blackmail, manipulation, and madness. A man named Jim Jones led a cult called the People's Temple in San Francisco during the 1970s. At first, people went to him because they believed him to be some kind of messiah, a prophet. But as cult leaders often are, for Jones, it was all about power and narcissism. He convinced hundreds of people to follow him to Guyana to build a commune that would be paradise on earth. But when they got there, he confiscated their passports, their money, and threatened them with their lives, blackmail, basically anything he could. Eerily, he staged rehearsals of an event that would cost them all their lives. When he was about to be caught, Jones ordered 900 of his followers to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, completing the largest mass self-inflicted massacre in the world. Number 5, the Great Depression. Anyone else fear a recession and worry about money constantly? Me too, which is why the Great Depression is terrifying. This event turned millionaires penniless practically overnight. It was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world and lasted a full decade. It all started when the stock market crashed in October 1929 that wiped out millions of investors. During the Roaring 20s, credit was introduced, which resulted in lots of people spending money that they didn't have because whatever, we'll just put it on our credit card. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, tycoons to crooks dumped their savings into stocks. The wealth of the US doubled during the 1920s, however, the stock market reached its peak in August 1929. The thing was, production was declining, unemployment was rising, therefore making stock prices much higher than they were actually worth. So, boom, everything crashed. 15 million people were unemployed, thousands homeless, farmers were so poor they couldn't even afford to harvest their crops, so they just rotted in the field. The only thing that pretty much brought North America out of it was World War II. You know things are bad when war is a good thing. Number 4, 9/11. Need I say more? Thousands upon thousands of voicemails were left that day of people either calling from the planes or the buildings themselves, saying goodbye to their loved ones. It was supposed to be just a normal day at the office, but on September 11th, 2001 at 8:45 a.m., an American Airlines Boeing 767 crashed into the 80th floor North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact alone took hundreds of lives, though hundreds more were trapped on the floors above. Evacuations were underway immediately, but only 18 minutes later, a second Boeing 767 crashed into the 60th floor, the South Tower. I have friends who had teachers run crying from the room when they heard because they had loved ones who worked there. Later, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, and another was hijacked bound for California, but passengers overthrew them and crashed the plane in a rural field, sacrificing their lives. Over 2,996 people died in the attacks, including the hijackers organized by Osama bin Laden. At the World Trade Center, 2,763 people died, including 343 firefighters and paramedics, 23 New York police officers, 37 port authorities, and many more. Nearly everyone has a memory from that day and remains one of the most horrific events in history. Number 3, the Great Leap Forward and Mao Zedong. If someone or something sounds just a little too optimistic, probably best to run away. I'm all for looking on the brighter side and inciting change, but the Great Leap Forward was in actual fact horrific. In fact, the entire rule of Mao Zedong was horrendous. Starting in 1958, the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, attempted to reform China in just 5 years. Millions of citizens were moved into communes, farming cooperatives, and small manufacturing centers. Children were taken away from their parents and put into large childcare centers, all to increase production. The aim was to increase China's agricultural output. However, his ridiculous farming strategies damaged acres upon acres of land and produced too little food. Backyard steel furnaces were built, and families were forced to meet impossible quotas. People began to starve. To combat rising resistance, he created the Red Army composed of girls and boys from the ages of 14 to 21 to roam cities and target enemies of the state, especially their teachers. He would make them wear dunce hats, cover their faces with ink, and make them crawl on all fours and bark like dogs. He also expanded a system of 1,000 forced labor camps, and this all happened like in the 50s, 60s, right after World War II. You'd think, you know? Number 2, World War I. Speaking of World Wars, we talked about World War II last time, so I think it's only fair we talk about World War I because it too was awful. The most important aspect of World War I was that it literally changed warfare forever. It was the first global war of the 20th century that introduced horrors the world had never seen. At first, the young men were excited to go off to war, an adventure, a way to finally become a hero like the ones in storybooks. It was supposed to be a quick victory done by Christmas, but the introduction of trench warfare, tanks, airplanes, submarines, modern artillery, and of course, poison gas, they were way in over their head. Many soon came to believe that what they were experiencing wasn't war but mass slaughter. If you went into no man's land, you were shot. If you didn't, you were court-martialed. To say it was carnage is an understatement, and the Allies almost lost. It was a close call. No one wanted a war like that ever again, but then the Treaty of Versailles was signed, providing the foundation for new horrors to rise just 2 decades later. And last but not least, the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery has happened across various periods of history all the way back to ancient times globally. History isn't short of tyrannical rulers who felt they had the right to decide who was lesser than. But the tradition of slavery came to a head during the Atlantic slave trade, which laid the foundation for centuries of oppression and violence. From approximately 1526 to 1867, 12.5 million people were shipped from Africa, while only 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. They were kept packed together on ships during the voyage, only separated by gender, without clothes, in crouched tiny spaces. The cruel conditions were most likely the primary cause of death on the ships during the voyage, with an average of 12% perishing. The heat and oxygen levels were so low that you couldn't even burn a candle. When they arrived, they were sold as slaves and forced to work in the New World under brutal and inhumane conditions. Their masters punished them and violated them in hellish ways. The slave trade left Africa behind in a swirl of lawlessness, violence, and economic disarray. Eventually, the US erupted in civil war over the abolition of slavery, and it was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865. However, still, segregation and mistreatment continued, leading to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Suffice it to say that even over a century later, racism and discrimination still linger. And that was our list for the top 10 events in history scarier than the Salem Witch Trials Part 2. If you like this video, you know what to do. I've been your host, Rachel Fisher. Until next time, stay spooky, because it's Halloween!